My name is Emily Parker. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a freelance graphic designer from my small apartment downtown. And the day my mother told me I wasn't aesthetic enough to stand beside my sister at her wedding was the day I stopped pretending our family was anything more than a carefully filtered Instagram post. You'd think that would be the part that hurt the most. Being told you're not pretty enough, not thin enough, not polished enough to fit into a color palette. But here's the thing about deep wounds. They don't come from strangers. They come from the people who taught you what love was supposed to look like. What hurt more wasn't the exclusion, it was the laughter. My mother's crystalline laugh when I asked if she was joking. My sister Vivian's eye roll, as if my confusion was an inconvenience to her vision board. My father's silence, that familiar, expensive silence he'd been buying us with for decades. What hurt most was realizing I'd spent 29 years trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided I didn't fit the frame. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This isn't a story about being excluded from a wedding. This is a story about the moment you realize that the people who raised you have been performing for an audience your entire life, and you were never part of the show. You were the stagehand, the assistant, the person who made everyone else look good, while remaining carefully cropped out of every memory. This is about the day I stopped apologizing for taking up space in my own family. And it started at a brunch table with mimosas and fresh flowers, where my mother's perfect world finally cracked. Before we dive into how I reclaimed my narrative, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this story. Where are you watching from? Drop your city below in the comments. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Before I tell you how it all fell apart, you need to understand what I thought we were. I grew up in Westridge Heights, one of those suburbs where every lawn looks like it's been measured with a ruler and every family waves from identical porches. My father, Robert Parker, made his money in venture capital, the kind of wealth that's quiet but absolute. My mother, Linda, made it her full-time career to ensure everyone knew we had it, without ever being crass enough to mention it directly. Vivian was born 3 years after me, and from the moment she arrived, she was perfect. I don't mean that with bitterness, I mean it literally. She was the kind of beautiful baby that strangers stopped to photograph. Blonde curls that caught sunlight, eyes like sea glass. A smile that seemed genetically engineered for Christmas cards. And me? I was fine. Brown hair that never quite did what it was supposed to. Average height, average build, average everything. I wore glasses until I was 16. I preferred books to parties. I was the practice child, the one parents figure out their mistakes on before their real production begins. But I didn't mind. Not at first. I have this memory from when Vivian was 7 and I was 10. She'd gotten lost at the mall, wandered off while Mom was trying on earrings at Nordstrom. I found her crying near the fountain, terrified and small. I held her hand and brought her back, and Mom hugged us both so tightly I could smell her perfume for hours afterward. "You're such a good big sister," she whispered into my hair. "Vivian is so lucky to have you." I held on to those words for years, replayed them like a song I needed to remember the lyrics to. Throughout our childhood, I was the responsible one. I helped Vivian with her homework when she struggled with math. I taught her how to ride a bike while Mom supervised from the porch. When she had nightmares, she'd crawl into my bed, and I'd tell her stories until she fell asleep. There was this unspoken contract in our family. Dad earned the money, Mom managed our image, Vivian was the star, and I was the support system. Everyone had a role. Everyone contributed to the family portrait. I didn't question it because I thought that's what families did. You played your part. You found your value in making other people shine. Mom used to say, "Emily, you're so practical, so dependable. We can always count on you." And I'd feel proud, like those qualities were just as valuable as beauty or charm or charisma. I was the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, who organized the holiday card list, who knew which caterer Mom preferred and which florist gave us the family discount. When Vivian got accepted to USC, I was the one who helped her pack, who drove her to campus, who called every week to make sure she was settling in okay. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Vivian told me during one of those calls, her voice thick with homesickness. "You'd figure it out," I said, "but you don't have to. I'm always here." That was my fatal mistake, believing that being needed was the same as being valued. By the time I hit my mid-20s, the family dynamic had calcified into something permanent. Vivian graduated and moved back home while she found herself, which mostly meant building her Instagram following and attending influencer events. Mom became her de facto manager, coaching her on brand partnerships and aesthetic cohesion. Dad continued to fund everything with silent approval, his love language fluent in bank transfers and credit card limits that never maxed out. And me? I'd moved into my apartment, started my freelance business, and showed up for every family dinner, every holiday, every obligation. I was still playing my part, still believing that consistency would eventually translate to belonging. There was this moment, God, I can see it so clearly now, when Vivian was 24. She'd just landed some sponsorship deal with a skincare company, and Mom threw a celebration dinner at the country club. Champagne, oysters, the works. "To Vivian," Dad raised his glass, "our beautiful, talented daughter who's making her mark on the world." Everyone clinked glasses, everyone smiled. No one mentioned that I'd just landed my biggest client, a rebrand for a tech startup that would keep my business afloat for 6 months. I'd mentioned it earlier, but it had dissolved into the conversation like sugar in hot water, present for a moment, then gone. I told myself it didn't matter, that my achievements were different, quieter, less photogenic. I told myself a lot of things back then. But here's what I know now. The foundation of a relationship isn't built on grand gestures. It's built on 1,000 small moments where someone shows you that you matter, where your joy is their joy, where your pain is felt as deeply as their own. I was the only one building that foundation. Everyone else was just posing for pictures on top of it. The shift didn't happen overnight. It never does with family. The cruelty comes in degrees, in increments so small you convince yourself you're imagining it. It started about 8 months before Vivian's engagement. She'd been dating Marcus for 2 years, some finance guy with perfect teeth and a portfolio that impressed Dad. They were the kind of couple that made other people feel inadequate just by existing. Every photo looked like an engagement shoot. Every date night ended up on social media with captions about finding your person. I was happy for her. I genuinely was. But somewhere around the time Marcus started coming to family dinners, the temperature in the room changed whenever I arrived. "Emily, you're here," Mom would say, as if my presence was mildly surprising rather than expected. The comments started small, observational, almost loving if you didn't listen to the subtext. "You know, Em, if you spent as much time on yourself as you do on your computer, you might actually meet someone. Vivian was just telling me about this amazing spin class. Maybe you should join her. It could be good bonding time. That shirt is interesting. Where did you get it?" "Oh, Target. Well, it's practical." Practical, that word again. It used to sound like a compliment. Now it sounded like an apology. The real turning point came at Vivian's 26th birthday party. Mom had rented out a private room at this trendy restaurant downtown, exposed brick, Edison bulbs, the kind of place where small plates cost what I spend on groceries for a week. I had arrived on time wearing a dress I thought was appropriate, black, simple, fitted. But the moment I walked in, I saw Mom's eyes do this thing, this quick scan from my hair to my shoes, and her smile tightened. "Oh, honey," she said quietly, "we're doing jewel tones tonight. Didn't you get my text?" I checked my phone. There was no text. There never had been. "I must have missed it," I said, even though we both knew that wasn't true.
The room was full of Vivian's friends, influencer types with perfect blowouts and designer handbags. Marcus was there, his arm around Vivian like a permanent accessory, and Dad, as always, was at the bar, nursing his scotch and nodding along to conversations he wasn't really part of. I found my place card at the table. I was seated at the far end, next to Vivian's friend's boyfriend, someone I'd never met who spent the entire dinner talking about crypto. Halfway through the meal, Mom stood up to give a toast. She talked about Vivian's beauty, her creativity, her bright future. She talked about how proud she was to be her mother. And, of course, Mom added, almost as an afterthought, we're grateful for Emily, too. Always so reliable, always there when we need something done. The table made polite sounds of agreement. A few people glanced my way with sympathy that felt worse than indifference. I smiled, I raised my glass, I played my part. But something inside me was starting to crack. The comments continued over the following months, each one building on the last. You know, Emily, not everyone is meant to be the center of attention. Some people are better in supporting roles. Vivian just has that star quality. You can't teach that. Maybe if you lost a few pounds, you'd photograph better. And then came the engagement. Marcus proposed at sunset on a beach in Malibu. The photos were magazine perfect. Vivian posted them immediately, and within hours she had thousands of likes, hundreds of comments, a cascade of digital validation. Mom called me that night, breathless with excitement. Em, you won't believe it. We're thinking destination wedding, maybe Italy or the Hamptons. Vivian wants something elegant, timeless, something people will remember forever. That sounds amazing, I said, and I meant it. We'll need your help, of course, with the planning, the details. You know how Vivian gets overwhelmed with logistics. Of course, I said, whatever you need. You're the best, Mom said. Then, almost offhandedly, she's already thinking about her bridesmaids. I think she's going for this soft, romantic aesthetic, very cohesive, very curated. There was something in her voice, something that made my stomach turn. That'll be beautiful, I managed. Mom hummed. She's very particular about how things look, but we'll figure it out. We always do. The call ended shortly after. I sat in my apartment, in the dark, holding my phone and trying to convince myself that the knot in my chest was just anxiety, just my imagination, just me once again reading too much into nothing. But deep down, I knew. I knew before the words were ever spoken. I knew I was being edited out. The brunch happened on a Sunday in March. Mom had texted the family group chat. Family meeting at the club, 11 a.m., important wedding discussion. I arrived 5 minutes early, which I always did. The country club dining room was flooded with natural light, all white linens and fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases. Mom and Vivian were already seated, heads bent together over a tablet, scrolling through what I assumed were Pinterest boards. Dad arrived shortly after me, kissed Mom on the cheek, and settled into his chair with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Coffee?" the server asked. "Please," I said, "black." Vivian glanced up. "Em, you're here. Good, we have a lot to cover." There was something different about the way she said it. Clinical, like I was a vendor she'd hired rather than her sister. Mom ordered mimosas for the table. Vivian pulled out a leather-bound planner, everything color-coded, everything perfect. "Okay," Vivian began, her voice bright with the kind of enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. "So Marcus and I have finalized the date, September 15th. Venue is locked. We're doing the Rosewood Estate." "Beautiful," Dad said, not looking up from his phone. "And we've narrowed down the color palette," Mom added. "Sage green and champagne. Very elegant, very Instagram-friendly." Vivian nodded. "Which brings us to the bridal party." My heart started beating faster. This was it, the moment where I'd officially be asked to be her maid of honor, where all the years of showing up, of being reliable, of being there would be acknowledged. "I've chosen 5 bridesmaids: Hannah, Alexis, Brooke, Madison, and Sienna." Silence. I waited for her to say my name, to realize she'd forgotten, to laugh and correct herself, but she just kept talking. They're all around the same height, which is great for photos, and they all fit the aesthetic I'm going for. Very cohesive. Vivian, I said quietly, what about me? She looked up, and for a split second, I saw something flicker across her face. Discomfort, guilt, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Oh, right. Mom set down her mimosa. Sweetheart, we've been meaning to talk to you about this. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against my thighs under the table. About what? Mom exchanged a glance with Vivian. Some silent communication I wasn't privy to. Emily, Mom said, her voice taking on that tone, the one she used when she was about to say something cruel but wanted it to sound reasonable. This wedding is very important to Vivian. It's been her dream since she was a little girl, and the photos, they're going to be everywhere, in magazines, online, framed in our home for the rest of our lives. I don't understand what that has to do with me, I said, even though I was starting to. Vivian sighed. Don't make this harder than it has to be. You know how particular I am about aesthetics, about branding. My bridesmaids need to look a certain way. They need to fit. Fit, I repeated. You know what she means, Mom said. Vivian has a vision, and you're different. You don't really photograph well, and your style is more practical. This is about creating a cohesive visual story. The words landed like physical blows, each one finding a tender place I didn't know existed. So I'm not pretty enough, I said. That's what you're saying. Oh, don't be dramatic, Vivian said, rolling her eyes. It's not about being pretty, it's about fitting the aesthetic. You don't have that polished look I'm going for. I looked at my father. He was staring at his coffee, jaw tight, saying nothing. Dad, I said. He cleared his throat. It's Vivian's wedding, Emily. She gets to choose. But I'm her sister. And you can still be there, Mom said, quickly. You can attend as a guest. You can help with the planning. You can take on a different role, something behind the scenes, where you're comfortable. I laughed. I didn't mean to, but the sound just came out, sharp and bitter and completely involuntary. Why are you laughing? Mom asked, her eyes narrowing. Because, I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. I just realized something. I've been playing a part in a show I was never actually cast in, and you've all been perfectly content letting me believe I mattered. Emily, you're being ridiculous, Vivian said. Am I? I pulled out my phone. My fingers were surprisingly steady as I opened the folder. The one I'd labeled Family Cloud years ago, the one I'd forgotten about until last week when I'd been organizing my digital files. The folder that contained every photo, every document, every receipt that had automatically synced from our family's shared cloud account, including the ones my mother thought she'd deleted. You want to talk about aesthetics? About what fits and what doesn't? About maintaining the perfect image? Mom's face changed, just slightly, a tightening around her eyes. What are you talking about? She asked. I turned my phone toward her. On the screen was a photo, time-stamped 5 years ago, my mother in a hotel lobby kissing a man who wasn't my father. The color drained from her face. Emily, she whispered. There's more, I said calmly. Hotel receipts, text messages, dozens of photos, all backed up to our family cloud, all time-stamped, all preserved perfectly. Dad looked up from his coffee. Vivian's eyes went wide. I've had these for years, I continued. I found them by accident when I was organizing digital storage, and I kept them, not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because some part of me knew. Some part of me always knew that eventually this family would go too far. Emily, please, Mom started. I'm not finished, I said calmly. You want to talk about aesthetics? About what looks good in photos? About maintaining an image? Well, Mom, how do you think this will look? How do you think Dad will feel when he sees what you've been doing? What do you think Vivian's perfect wedding will look like when everyone knows the truth about our perfect family? The table was silent. Mom's hands were shaking. Dad was staring at her, his face unreadable. Vivian looked between us, her mouth open, no words coming out. I don't fit your aesthetic, I said, standing up. That's fine, but neither does the truth. And between the two of us, I think I'm going to age better. I left my coffee untouched. I left my family sitting in their shock. I left the country club and didn't look back. I'm going to stop here for a second. If this story is resonating with you at all, or if you've ever felt the pain of being misunderstood by the people who are supposed to love you most, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It really lets me know that sharing these hard stories is worth it.
My phone started ringing before I even got to my car. Mom, Vivian, Mom again, Dad. I didn't answer. I drove home in complete silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I felt numb, not satisfied, not victorious, just empty, like I'd finally stopped carrying something I didn't know I'd been holding. The texts started 20 minutes after I got home. Mom, Emily, we need to talk. What you did was unacceptable. Vivian, how could you do this to me? This is my wedding. Mom, your father is very upset. You've put me in an impossible position. Vivian, you're being so selfish right now. I put my phone on silent and set it face down on my kitchen counter. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I ordered takeout, opened a bottle of wine, and watched an entire movie without checking my phone once. The true fallout began the next day. Dad called at 7 in the morning. I let it go to voicemail. He left a 2-minute message, his voice tight with controlled anger. Emily, your mother explained everything. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but you need to delete those files. This is family business, private. I won't have you holding this over our heads. Call me back. I didn't. By noon, Vivian had posted a cryptic Instagram story, one of those quotes about toxic people and chosen family that her followers would eat up without understanding the context. Within an hour, she'd gotten hundreds of supportive comments, people validating her without knowing what they were validating. Mom sent an email, subject line, "We need to talk about your behavior." I deleted it without reading. But the real chaos happened at my Aunt Karen's house that Wednesday. She'd called me directly, her voice gentle in a way my own mother's never was. Emily, honey, what's going on? Linda called me in tears. She said you've been threatening her. I haven't threatened anyone, I said calmly. I just told the truth. There was a pause. What truth? So I told her. All of it. The wedding exclusion, the aesthetic comments, the years of being treated like I was less than, and finally, what I'd found in the cloud storage. Aunt Karen was quiet for a long time. "Oh, Emily," she finally said, "I'm so sorry." "For what?" I asked. "For not seeing it sooner, for not saying something. I'd always thought, I don't know, I thought Linda was just particular. I didn't realize how she was treating you." It was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged it. The first time someone had said out loud that I wasn't imagining things, that the cruelty was real. I cried. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet tears that I couldn't quite hold back. "What are you going to do?" Aunt Karen asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't want to blow up the family. I don't want to hurt Dad, but I'm not going to pretend anymore. I'm not going to keep being the person everyone uses when it's convenient and discards when it's not." "Good," she said firmly. "You deserve better than that." Over the next week, the family fractured in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dad moved into a hotel. He hadn't said anything directly to me, but Aunt Karen told me he'd gone silent, processing.
Mom, according to multiple sources, was having a breakdown. She'd canceled her book club meetings, stopped posting on social media, and was apparently seeing a therapist for the first time in her life. Vivian sent me one final text. "I hope you're happy. You've ruined everything." I almost responded, almost tried to explain that I hadn't ruined anything. I just stopped maintaining the illusion. But what was the point? People who are determined to misunderstand you will find a way, no matter what you say. Instead, I blocked her number. The interesting thing about standing up for yourself is that it reveals who people really are. Some of Vivian's friends reached out to me privately, girls I'd barely spoken to, asking what happened. When I told them, their responses varied from shocked to understanding to, "Honestly, I always thought your family was weird to you." My cousin James, who I'd always been close with, called me. "I heard," he said. "Are you okay?" "I think so," I said. "Good. For what it's worth, I think what you did took guts, and I think they've had it coming for a while." Small validations like that kept me afloat. Messages from people I hadn't talked to in years, saying they'd noticed the family dynamic, saying they'd always wondered why I put up with it. I'd thought I was alone. I'd thought I was the problem. But I wasn't. The problem was a family that valued image over substance, performance over authenticity, aesthetic over love. And I was finally done being the person who made their performance possible.
Healing didn't look how I expected it to. I thought there would be some grand moment of clarity, some dramatic turning point where everything suddenly made sense. But real healing is quieter than that. It's making the decision every single day to choose yourself over the comfort of familiar dysfunction. The first thing I did was find a therapist. Her name was Dr. Martinez, and she specialized in family trauma. I'd resisted therapy for years because I'd convinced myself my problems weren't bad enough to warrant professional help. But that's the insidious thing about emotional abuse. It teaches you to minimize your own pain. "Tell me about your family," Dr. Martinez said in our first session. I started to give her the rehearsed version, the acceptable version, the one that made everything sound understandable. She stopped me. "Emily," she said gently, "I didn't ask you to defend them. I asked you to tell me about them." That distinction changed everything. I started journaling, not about what happened, but about how I felt, about the parts of myself I'd suppressed to fit into a family that had no room for me. I wrote about the little girl who thought being needed was the same as being loved. I wrote about the teenager who learned to make herself smaller so others could shine. I wrote about the woman who finally said enough. I also started saying no. When Mom reached out after 3 weeks, a carefully worded text asking if we could move past this, I said no. When Vivian sent her wedding invitation with a handwritten note saying, "I hope you'll still come as a guest," I said no. When Dad called to tell me I was being unnecessarily difficult, I said no. Each no felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd given away. But healing wasn't just about boundaries. It was about rebuilding, about figuring out who I was when I wasn't performing the role they'd assigned to me. I joined a local art class, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. Turns out I'm decent with watercolors. Not great, but decent. And the point wasn't to be great. The point was to do something purely for my own enjoyment. I started dating, nothing serious, just getting back out there, remembering what it felt like to be seen by someone who didn't have a predetermined idea of who I should be. I made new friends, real ones, the kind who asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer, the kind who showed up when I needed them, not just when it was convenient. 6 months after the brunch, Vivian's wedding came and went. I didn't attend. I didn't post about it. I didn't even look at the photos when they inevitably flooded my social media feeds. Instead,
I spent that day hiking with a friend I'd met in my art class. We talked about everything and nothing. We laughed. We stopped at a roadside stand and bought fresh peaches. It was one of the best days I'd had in years. Aunt Karen sent me photos later, not of the wedding, but of the aftermath. Apparently, Mom and Dad had maintained a cold civility throughout the event, standing on opposite sides of the venue, their marriage a performance for the cameras. Vivian had looked beautiful, of course, but according to Karen, she'd seemed distracted, anxious, not quite the fairy tale she'd imagined. I think she realized something was missing, Karen told me over coffee. Not you specifically, but something real. Something authentic. The whole thing felt hollow. I felt a pang of sympathy for Vivian, not enough to reach out, but enough to recognize that she was also a victim of our family's toxicity, even if she'd benefited more than I had. The thing about walking away from toxic family is that people expect you to be angry forever. They expect you to hold on to the rage, to let it define you. But anger is exhausting. And at some point, you realize that holding on to it only hurts you. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just free. I didn't forgive them. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't mandatory for healing. You can acknowledge what happened, understand why it happened, and still choose not to reconcile. Forgiveness would require them to understand what they did wrong, to apologize, to change. And they didn't. Mom sent a Christmas card last December, one of those family photo cards with everyone smiling. There was a generic note inside. "Hope you're well. We miss you." I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I'd built a new life, one where my value wasn't determined by how well I served others, where my worth wasn't measured by how seamlessly I fit into someone else's aesthetic. And that life, that quiet, imperfect, authentic life, was worth protecting.
So here's what I learned from all of this. Being excluded from my sister's wedding wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was spending 29 years believing I had to earn my place in my own family. The tragedy was thinking that if I just tried harder, if I just made myself more useful, more convenient, more invisible when necessary, I would finally be enough. But enough for who? For people who valued image over substance? For people who saw me as a supporting character in their narrative rather than the protagonist of my own? I used to think family meant unconditional love. Now I know it just means biology. Real love, the kind that actually sustains you, is built on respect, reciprocity, and genuine care. And those things aren't guaranteed just because you share DNA. Some people will hear this story and think I overreacted. They'll say family is family, that I should have been the bigger person, that holding on to that information for years was manipulative. Maybe they're right, but I'd rather be the person who stood up for herself than the person who spent her entire life apologizing for existing. I still design websites. I still live in my small apartment. I still drink my coffee black and prefer books to parties. But now I do those things without the weight of other people's expectations crushing me. I don't know what happened with my parents' marriage. I don't know if Vivian ever figured out what was missing from her perfect wedding. I don't know if they think about me the way I sometimes, in quieter moments, think about them. But I know this. I am enough. Not because I'm useful or convenient or aesthetically pleasing, but because I exist. Because I'm worthy of love and respect and a place at the table, literally and metaphorically. To anyone watching this who's ever felt like the family scapegoat, like the person who doesn't quite fit, like you're being edited out of your own story, you're not imagining it. Your feelings are valid, your pain is real, and you deserve better. You deserve to be seen, to be valued, to take up space without apologizing for it. This was another story from Revenge Room, where we turn pain into purpose and betrayal into balance. Please don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next transformation.
Have you ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you? How did you rebuild trust? Share your story in the comments below. Where are you watching from? Let me know. And remember, the best revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming so genuinely happy that the people who hurt you no longer matter. I'm Emily Parker, and I finally fit into my own life.
Have you ever been betrayed by family that were meant to protect you? How did you rebuild trust? What's one thing you learned about yourself after a betrayal? Share one moment in your healing journey that changed everything. Drop your answers in the comments below. I read every single one. This was another story from Revenge Room, where we turn pain into purpose and betrayal into balance. Please don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next transformation.